Most people think success comes from big decisions, but what if everything changes because of something so small you almost ignore it? In a quiet town somewhere in the Midwest, there lived a young man named Ethan Miller, and if you asked anyone about him, they would all say the same thing. Ethan was lazy, not just a little lazy, but the kind of lazy that finds a shortcut even when there is nothing to cut short. Every morning he woke up late, every task felt like a burden, and every opportunity slipped through his fingers like it didn't matter, but the truth was, it did matter, more than he was willing to admit. Ethan lived with his parents in a small house just a few miles outside town. His father worked long hours trying to keep everything together, and his mother did her best to stay hopeful. But deep down, they both worried about Ethan, not because he wasn't smart, but because he never used it. He always chose the easy way, the comfortable way, the way that required the least effort, and over time, that choice started to define him. People stopped expecting anything from him. His friends moved forward, chasing goals, building skills, making something of their lives, while Ethan stayed exactly where he was, stuck in the same routine, day after day, doing just enough to get by, but never enough to grow. And then one afternoon, everything hit him at once. He had just lost a simple job opportunity, something almost anyone could have handled, and as he stood there, watching someone else take the chance he didn't even try for, he felt something he had been avoiding for a long time: disappointment, not from others, but from himself. For the first time, Ethan realized that his problem wasn't bad luck, it wasn't timing, and it wasn't the world being unfair. It was something much closer, something much smaller, something he had been ignoring every single day. And that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe his life wasn't stuck because of one big mistake, but because of hundreds of small ones he kept repeating without even noticing. And right there, in that quiet moment, without any big plan or dramatic promise, something inside him shifted. Not everything, just one tiny thing, something so simple it almost felt pointless. But that small change was about to challenge everything he believed about himself. Ethan did not wake up early the next day because he suddenly became disciplined. He woke up because he could not ignore the feeling anymore, the quiet disappointment that stayed with him through the night. So when his alarm went off 10 minutes earlier than usual, his first instinct was to turn it off and go back to sleep, just like he always did. But this time something felt different, not stronger, not louder, just present. And instead of making a big decision or promising to change his life, he made a small choice. He sat up, that was it. No grand plan, no motivation speech in his head, just sitting up in bed while the room was still quiet and the world outside had not fully started moving yet. For a moment he wondered if this even mattered. 10 minutes earlier did not seem like anything that could change a life. But he stayed awake. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood there thinking about how simple it was. Nothing had changed, but at the same time something had. That morning felt slightly different, not better, just different, and that difference stayed with him as the day went on. When he had a small task to do, he noticed he finished it a little quicker. When he felt the urge to delay something, he paused for a second longer than usual, and, although he still avoided effort, there was now a tiny space between his habit and his action, and in that space, he started to see what he had never seen before, that his laziness was not one big problem. It was a collection of small choices repeated every single day. Later that afternoon, Ethan ran into Mr. Parker, an older man who lived a few houses down, and was known for always working on something, fixing a fence, cleaning his yard, building small things with his hands. Ethan had always thought Mr. Parker was just someone who liked to stay busy for no reason, but that day, as he watched him carefully measure a piece of wood before making a cut, he felt curious. Why do you take so much time for something so small? Ethan asked without thinking. Mr. Parker looked at him and smiled. Because small things decide how big things turn out, he said calmly. Ethan did not respond right away, but those words stayed in his mind, repeating quietly as the day went on. That night, when he lay in bed again, he did not think about changing everything. He thought about doing one small thing again, just one. The next morning, the alarm went off 10 minutes early, and this time, getting up felt slightly easier, not because he had changed, but because he had already done it once, and without realizing it, Ethan had just taken the first step into something that most people overlook, the power of repeating something small until it starts to shape who you are. By the third morning, something unusual began to happen, not something big or impressive, but something quiet and steady. Ethan woke up before the alarm. Not fully awake, but aware, and instead of fighting the moment, he sat up again. Just like the days before, the same small action, repeated without excitement, without motivation, but also without resistance, and for the first time in a long while, his mornings did not feel rushed or heavy. They felt open, like there was space to think, to notice, to choose. Later that day, Ethan found himself doing something he would normally avoid. He picked up a simple task around the house and finished it without putting it off. It was not perfect, it was not fast, but it was done, and that small completion gave him a feeling he had not experienced in a long time, a quiet sense of control, as if he was finally doing something instead of just thinking about it, and that feeling stayed with him, growing slightly stronger with each small action. As the days passed, Ethan did not suddenly become hardworking or driven. He still felt the pull of his old habits, the desire to delay, to rest, to choose comfort. But now there was something else alongside it, a growing awareness. Every time he noticed himself about to fall back into the same pattern, he paused, just for a moment, and sometimes that pause was enough to change what he did next. One afternoon, Mr. Parker saw him walking by and called him over. He handed Ethan a small wooden board and a measuring tape. "I want you to mark exactly 12 inches on this," he said. Ethan looked confused. It seemed too simple. But he took the tape and carefully measured. This time he did not rush. He remembered what Mr. Parker had said, that small things decide how big things turn out. When he finished, Mr. Parker nodded and said, "Most people think they need to change their whole life at once. But they fail because they ignore the small things they do every day." Ethan listened quietly, and for the first time, he understood something deeper. His problem had never been a lack of ability, it had been a pattern of small decisions that led him nowhere, and now, without making any big promises, he was starting to build a different pattern, one that did not look impressive from the outside, but felt different on the inside. Each small habit, each repeated action, was slowly changing how he saw himself, not as someone who could not change, but as someone who was already changing, and although no one else noticed it yet, something real was beginning to take shape, something that would soon be tested in a way he could not expect. Days turned into a quiet rhythm that no one else seemed to notice. But for Ethan, each day felt slightly different from the last, not easier, not perfect, but more intentional. He still woke up 10 minutes earlier, still made small choices that seemed almost meaningless, but those small choices began to connect, like pieces of something slowly forming. One morning he decided to step outside after waking up. The air was cool and still, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel rushed or behind. He just stood there, taking a breath, noticing how calm everything felt before the town fully came alive. Later that day, his father asked him to help with a simple task in the garage. Something Ethan would normally delay or avoid, but this time, he did not argue. He followed through, not because he felt motivated, but because he had started to trust the process of doing small things right. As they worked side by side, his father glanced at him with a quiet surprise. It was not a big moment. No words were spoken about it, but Ethan could feel it, a small shift in how he was seen, and that mattered more than he expected. However, not everything was smooth. There were still moments when his old habits tried to pull him back, moments when he wanted to skip, to delay, to return to comfort, and one afternoon, he gave in. He spent hours doing nothing, telling himself he would get back on track later. But when the evening came, that familiar feeling returned, the quiet disappointment. Except this time it felt different. It was sharper, clearer, because now he knew what it felt like to do things differently, and that contrast made it impossible to ignore. Instead of letting it spiral, he made another small choice. He did one simple task before going to bed, just one, not to fix the day, but to remind himself that one moment does not define everything. The next morning, he woke up again, 10 minutes earlier, and this time, it felt like a decision, not an accident. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice something deeper. His actions were no longer random, they were starting to follow a pattern, a pattern built on repetition, not intensity, and that pattern was slowly changing how he approached everything, from small chores to simple responsibilities. And then, without warning, an opportunity appeared. A local workshop in town was looking for someone to help with basic tasks, nothing complicated. But it required consistency, showing up on time, following instructions, paying attention to details. It was the kind of opportunity Ethan would have ignored before. But now, as he stood there thinking about it, he realized something important. This was not about talent, it was about whether he could continue doing the small things he had started, and for the first time, he felt ready to try, not because he was confident, but because he had already begun to prove something to himself. One small habit at a time. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the small workshop at the edge of town, a simple building with faded paint and a wooden sign that creaked slightly in the wind. It was nothing special, but to him, it felt like a test, not of his skill, but of everything he had quietly been building over the past few days. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by a man named Mr. Collins, the owner, who looked at him with a calm but serious expression, the kind of look that did not expect much but would notice everything. Ethan was given simple instructions: sweep the floor, organize tools, carry small materials from one side of the shop to the other. Tasks so basic that they did not require talent, only attention and consistency. At first, Ethan felt that familiar voice in his mind telling him this was too small to matter, that it was not worth the effort. But this time, he did not listen. He focused on doing each task carefully, just like he had started doing at home, measuring small actions instead of chasing big results. The first hour felt slow, every movement required effort, not because the work was hard, but because his mind kept trying to drift back to old habits, to shortcuts, to distractions. But each time, he brought himself back, one task at a time. By the second hour, something shifted. The work began to feel smoother, not easier, but more natural, like his body was starting to follow a rhythm he had not felt before. Mr. Collins did not say much, but he watched, noticing how Ethan handled even the smallest details, how he placed tools back exactly where they belonged, how he completed one task before moving to the next, and by the end of the day, something unexpected happened. Ethan was asked to come back the next morning. It was not a big achievement, no celebration, no praise, just a simple opportunity to continue. But to Ethan, it meant more than anything he had experienced before, because for the first time, he had earned something through consistency, not luck. As the days went on, the work did not become easier. There were still moments when he felt tired, when he wanted to slow down or cut corners, and sometimes he did make small mistakes, forgetting a step, rushing through a task, but instead of giving up or falling back completely, he returned to the same principle that had brought him this far: do one small thing right, then repeat it. Slowly, those small actions began to stack. His speed improved, his focus sharpened, and even though no one said it out loud, he could feel the difference in how he was treated, not as the lazy boy everyone once knew, but as someone who could be trusted with small responsibilities. And that trust, built step by step, started to grow into something larger, something that would soon be tested in a way Ethan had never faced before. A moment where all the small habits he had built would either hold him steady or fall apart under pressure. One morning, just as Ethan was beginning to feel comfortable with his routine, Mr. Collins handed him a task that felt different from anything before. He pointed to a large set of wooden shelves that needed to be reorganized, measured, and rebuilt to fit new equipment. It was not complicated, but it required precision, patience, and most importantly, consistency over several hours without losing focus. Ethan looked at the shelves and felt that old doubt creeping back in, the voice that told him he was not ready, that this was too much, that he would eventually mess it up like he always used to. But this time, he did not step back. He simply nodded and began with the first small step, measuring one section carefully, just like Mr. Parker had shown him, 12 inches at a time, making small marks, checking twice before moving forward. The first hour passed slowly. Every movement felt deliberate, almost too careful, and a part of him wanted to rush, to finish faster, to prove something quickly, but another part reminded him of what had brought him here, not speed, not talent, but doing small things right. So he continued, one section after another, each completed piece building a quiet confidence inside him. However, as the day went on, the pressure began to grow, the work was repetitive, and his focus started to slip. At one point, he made a small mistake, a measurement slightly off, something easy to ignore. Something the old Ethan would have left as it was, but now, he stopped, looked at it carefully, and made a choice. He went back and fixed it, even though it meant losing time, even though no one had noticed, because for him, it was no longer about finishing, it was about doing it right. By the afternoon, fatigue set in, his arms felt heavy, his mind grew tired, and the temptation to cut corners returned stronger than before. This was the moment where everything could fall apart, not because the task was too hard, but because consistency is hardest when no one is watching. Ethan paused for a second, took a breath, and returned to the same simple approach, one small step at a time. He did not think about the entire project. He focused on the next measurement, the next adjustment, the next action. And slowly, the pressure began to settle. The task no longer felt overwhelming, it felt manageable again. By the end of the day, the shelves were not fully finished, but they were solid, aligned, and carefully built. When Mr. Collins came over to inspect the work, he ran his hand along the edge and nodded slightly, not impressed by speed, but by precision. "You will finish this tomorrow," he said calmly. And as Ethan stepped outside that evening, tired but steady, he realized something important. This was not just a test of skill, it was a test of whether the small habits he had built could hold under pressure, and tomorrow would reveal the answer. The next morning arrived with a quiet weight in the air, not heavy, but enough for Ethan to feel it the moment he opened his eyes. This was different from the days before. This was not just about showing up or repeating small actions. This was about finishing something that demanded consistency from start to end. When he stepped into the workshop, the unfinished shelves stood exactly where he had left them, waiting, not for effort, but for precision. Mr. Collins did not say much, he simply nodded, and that was enough to signal that the responsibility was now entirely in Ethan's hands. As he picked up the measuring tape again, the same doubts returned, whispering that maybe yesterday was just luck, that maybe today he would fall back into old patterns. But instead of arguing with those thoughts, Ethan did something he had learned. Over the past few days, he ignored the noise and focused on the next small step. He measured carefully, adjusted the wood, secured each piece, one action at a time. The hours passed, and the work demanded more from him than before, not just effort, but attention without distraction, and that was where the real challenge began. Because consistency is not tested when things are easy, it is tested when the mind grows tired, when the body slows down, when no one is there to remind you why you started. At one point, Ethan noticed his focus slipping, his hands moving faster but less carefully. And he caught himself before making another mistake. He paused, stepped back, and reset, not by taking a long break, but by returning to the same simple principle, one correct action at a time. This moment felt small, almost invisible, but it was everything, because this was where most people fail, not in big decisions, but in small moments when they choose speed over consistency. As the afternoon light began to fade through the workshop windows, Ethan continued, not rushing, not slowing down too much, just steady. Each piece falling into place, each measurement checked twice, and slowly the shelves began to take their final shape, straight, balanced, and solid. When he placed the last piece and stepped back, there was no dramatic feeling, no sudden rush of excitement, just a quiet sense of completion, something he had rarely felt before. When Mr. Collins walked over and examined the finished work, he ran his hand along the edges again, this time stopping for a moment longer. Then he looked at Ethan and said, "You did not rush. You did not cut corners." That is rare. Ethan did not know what to say, but he understood what it meant. This was not about building shelves, it was about proving something deeper, that the small habits he had started were no longer temporary actions, they were becoming part of who he was. And as he stood there, realizing this, he also understood that this was only the beginning, because once you prove you can stay consistent, the next challenge is not whether you can do it once, but whether you can continue doing it when things get even harder. The days that followed did not bring comfort, they brought more responsibility, and with it, a new kind of pressure that Ethan had never faced before. Mr. Collins began trusting him with slightly more complex tasks. Not because Ethan had become highly skilled, but because he had proven something more valuable, that he could be consistent even when no one was watching, and that trust slowly changed the way Ethan saw himself. He was no longer just completing small tasks, he was becoming someone others could rely on. However, with that trust came a new challenge, expectations. One morning, Mr. Collins handed him a set of instructions for organizing incoming materials, something that required timing, accuracy, and coordination, multiple steps that had to be done in the right order. Ethan felt a familiar tension in his chest. This was no longer about repeating the same simple habit. This required him to think ahead, to stay focused for longer periods, and to avoid mistakes that could affect more than just himself. As he started, everything felt manageable at first. He followed each step carefully, just like he had trained himself to do. But as the workload increased, so did the pressure. Small distractions began to appear, noise from outside, thoughts drifting in his mind, and the quiet urge to rush through parts that felt repetitive. This was the moment where his old habits tried to return, not loudly, but subtly, suggesting that it was fine to cut a corner here, to skip a detail there, because no one would notice. And for a brief second, Ethan hesitated, standing between two choices: the easy way he used to take, and the steady path he had been building. And in that moment, something became clear to him. This was not about doing something big, it was about protecting the small habits he had worked so hard to build. So instead of speeding up, he slowed down. He checked each step, even when it felt unnecessary. He corrected small mistakes before they became bigger ones, and slowly, the chaos turned into order. By the end of the day, everything was in place, not perfect, but solid. And more importantly, done with intention. When Mr. Collins reviewed the work, he did not just look at the result, he looked at the process behind it, and he could see the difference. "You are not just working harder," he said quietly, "you are working differently." Ethan nodded, understanding that the difference was not in effort, but in consistency. And as he walked home that evening, something inside him shifted again, not because he had completed a task, but because he had faced pressure and did not break. He had stayed steady, one small action at a time, and for the first time, he realized that the real change was not in what he was doing, but in who he was becoming, someone who could handle more, not by doing more at once, but by staying consistent when it mattered most. Months passed. But the change in Ethan was no longer something quiet or hidden, it was visible in the way he moved, the way he spoke, and most importantly, in the way he handled his responsibilities. The young man who once avoided effort now showed up every morning before the workshop opened, not because he was forced to, but because it had become part of who he was. His small habit of waking up 10 minutes earlier had grown into something much bigger, not in size, but in impact. It had changed how he approached every part of his day. One morning, as he was organizing tools with the same steady focus he had built over time, Mr. Collins called him over and handed him a new set of keys. This time, it was not for a simple task, it was for opening the workshop. "You have been consistent," Mr. Collins said calmly, "and that matters more than anything else." Ethan held the keys in his hand and felt a quiet sense of realization. This was not a reward for talent, it was the result of something much smaller, something most people overlook. As he unlocked the door the next morning and stepped inside before anyone else arrived, he paused for a moment, looking around the empty space, remembering who he used to be, someone who would have never been trusted with something like this, someone who would have looked for the easiest way out instead of showing up every day. And in that moment, he understood the full truth of what had happened. His life did not change because of one big decision, it changed because of a small habit he chose to repeat, again and again, even when it felt pointless, even when no one noticed. That habit had shaped his actions had shaped his results. And those results had slowly reshaped his identity. He was no longer trying to prove something to others, he had already proven something to himself. That change does not come from sudden effort, it comes from consistent action. Later that day, as he worked alongside Mr. Collins, he noticed a new worker struggling with simple tasks, moving quickly but making mistakes. Trying to do everything at once but finishing nothing properly. Ethan watched for a moment, then walked over and said something. Simple: slow down, do one thing right, then repeat it. The worker looked at him, unsure at first, but Ethan recognized that look. It was the same confusion he once had, the same belief that big results required big actions, but now he knew better. As the day continued, Ethan returned to his work, steady as always, one small action at a time, and although nothing dramatic happened, no sudden breakthrough or life-changing moment, something much more powerful had already taken place. He had become the kind of person who no longer waits for change, but builds it, quietly, consistently, every single day.